Welcome, and many thanks for joining us for an exciting session on the power of research to help end discrimination and reduce inequality for LGBTQ youth and families. I'm Adam Gamoran, president of the William T. Grant Foundation. I'm joined by my colleague, Dr. Jenny Irons, a program officer at the foundation, and two of our grantees, both distinguished researchers, Professor Mark Hatzenbeuhler of Harvard University and Professor Rachel Farr of the University of Kentucky. Both are William T. Grant scholars. Also on hand are Billy Hunter and Lenore Nyer from our communications team. Today's webinar has two parts. The first part will be to focus on research to stop discrimination and reduce inequality for LGBTQ youth and families. Our first speaker, as I mentioned, is Professor Mark Hatzenbeuhler, and he will discuss his research on litigation to end homophobic bullying. Our second speaker, as I mentioned, is Rachel Farr, and she will discuss her research on addressing discrimination for youth whose parents identify as LGBTQ. After that, we'll turn to questions. You'll see on the GoToWebinar panel, probably on the right side of your screen, a little box for questions. Please enter your questions there. You can enter them at any time, and we will respond to them when we get to the questions portion of the webinar. Part two of the webinar is about how to obtain grants to support research on reducing inequality. We'll talk first about the William T. Grant Scholars Program, the program that funds both of today's presenters. And then we'll talk about our major research grants program. We'll provide some resources and tips, and then once again, we will stop for questions. Please note that the slides and recordings from today's webinar will be posted within the next 2 weeks. And again, remember to put your questions in the question box in the GoToWebinar panel. All right, let's get started. First, a little background about the William T. Grant Foundation. The foundation's mission is to support research to improve the lives of young people. In pursuit of this goal, we invest our research dollars in two focus areas. Our Use of Research Evidence initiative supports studies on strategies to improve the use of research evidence in policy and practice in ways that benefit youth. Our Reducing Inequality initiative supports studies about ways programs, policies, and practices can reduce inequality and outcomes among young people in the United States. Today's webinar focuses on grant making in the Reducing Inequality focus area. Now, evidence on the extent, sources, and consequences of inequality is widely available, but evidence on ways to reduce inequality is much less prevalent. And we need new research to inform efforts to reduce inequality. For that reason, we focused our grant making on studies of programs, policies, and practices that reduce inequality in youth outcomes. Now, much of our funding has gone to studies of reducing inequality in racial, ethnic, and economic inequality, and that's extremely important. But today we showcase reducing inequality for LGBTQ populations. This research is sorely needed. As we know, discrimination against the LGBTQ community, both interpersonal, through interactions with other people, and structural, built into the laws, protections, or absence of protections in our society, are all too common. And this discrimination is harmful to both mental and physical health of our young people and their families. We'd like to see more research to reduce inequality for LGBTQ youth and families. And we're calling on our partners in the LGBTQ funder community to join us to advance this learning agenda. Whether you support research or services, the learning agenda demands research to guide policy and implementation. Many funders are committed to this agenda, and we hope to learn from you. Today, we see as the opening of a dialogue, a learning and partnership opportunity. And we have researchers on this call as well, who must also be part of this partnership, who can learn how to obtain funding for this work, and who can counsel us on what sorts of funding are needed. I will now turn to two of our grantees, Mark Hatzenbeuhler and Rachel Farr, who will each discuss how and why their research addresses the question of reducing inequality for LGBTQ youth and families. We begin today with Professor Hatzenbeuhler. Mark, over to you.
Thanks so much, Adam, and thanks for inviting me to be a part of this great webinar. So I'll be talking today about some of the work that my colleagues and I have been doing on my scholars project that's examining whether litigation is an effective strategy for reducing youth inequalities, with a particular focus on a case study of homophobic bullying. So bias-based bullying has been defined as attacks that are motivated by a victim's actual or perceived membership in a socially marginalized group. Research has shown that bias-based bullying is a common experience among youth. For instance, data shown here from the California Healthy Kids Survey found that 40% of youth reported bias-based bullying related to sexual orientation, race, religion, gender, or physical or mental disability in the past 12 months. Research has also shown that homophobic bullying, which is a specific subtype of bias-based bullying related to sexual orientation, has been linked to significantly worse psychosocial and school-related outcomes, as well as more negative perceptions of school climate as compared to general forms of bullying that are unrelated to bias. So given the prevalence and associated negative consequences that are associated with homophobic bullying among youth, reducing homophobic bullying represents an important public health priority. So what do we know about how to reduce homophobic bullying? Unfortunately, some existing approaches to reducing it lack empirical evidence. For instance, studies of universal bullying prevention programs in schools rarely focus on bias and rarely include measures of homophobic bullying. So as a result, it is unknown whether these programs are effective in reducing homophobic bullying as they are for bullying that's unrelated to bias. In addition, other approaches produce either mixed or even harmful effects. So for example, research shows that teachers and support professionals report feeling the least comfortable intervening with homophobic bullying compared to bullying related to other issues. At the same time, teachers who wish to intervene are often constrained from doing so due to some state policies that place unique burdens on teachers. So given the lack of strong evidence for effective strategies for reducing homophobic bullying, the field requires additional strategies. So my WT Grant Scholars Project focuses on litigation as one potential strategy at the structural level for reducing homophobic bullying and associated inequalities among youth. So why this focus on litigation? Well, we focused on it for both practical and empirical reasons. So litigation is a widely used yet empirically understudied strategy for addressing a variety of stigma-related harms among youth. It's been called by legal scholar Gwen Leachman the most visible and established of all the LGBT movement's tactics. But of course, this strategy is not unique to the LGBT movement. Litigation has been used to address inequalities related to numerous status characteristics, including race and sex. Another reason for focusing on litigation is that our prior research has shown that laws contribute to sexual orientation-related disparities in health. So for example, in quasi-experimental studies like the one shown here, we've found that mental health problems increase among sexual minority adults who live in states that have recently implemented laws that deny services to same-sex couples, as shown in gray here. In contrast, mental health problems don't increase for any of the other comparison groups. So with that background, let me walk you through what we've accomplished on our project so far. So first, we conducted a comprehensive search of litigation related to sexual orientation-based harassment and bullying in California schools between the years 2000 and 2015. And we identified 33 unique cases that met our criteria. Second, we developed and refined a coding scheme to evaluate the outcomes of this litigation. Third, we completed the legal content analyses of these cases. These analyses were completed by 2 independent legal coders who had high agreement in their assessment of the outcomes of these cases. And then finally, we linked these legal codes to 15 consecutive waves of data from the California Healthy Kids Survey, which is the largest statewide survey in the United States of youth protective and risk factors, including homophobic bullying. We have a sample size of over 5 million youth from nearly 3,000 schools in this data set. So to examine the relationship between litigation and homophobic bullying, we used what is known as a difference in difference analysis, which is a causal identification strategy in quasi-experimental designs like the one we have, where we're not able to randomly assign schools to litigation. So I'll briefly walk you through how this approach works. So this technique takes advantage of longitudinal data from both an intervention and a control group. So in this case, the intervention group in our study is schools involved in litigation, and the control group is schools within the same county, but which were neither involved in litigation nor were in the same district as the schools that were involved in litigation. So in the pre-intervention period shown here, you want to see what is known as common or parallel trends between the intervention group, shown here in red, and the control group, shown here in green. And in fact, that's what we observe in our data. The trends in homophobic bullying are not statistically different from each other in the pre-intervention period between the intervention and control groups. And so this means that we can be more confident that any observed changes after the litigation aren't due to pre-existing differences in rates of homophobic bullying between these two groups. So having established these parallel trends, we can then go on to see what happened as a result of the litigation intervention. So let me walk you through these results. On the y-axis is the adjusted odds ratio. So you can interpret a 1, for example, as no difference in rates of homophobic bullying, and a 1.5 as a 50% increase in homophobic bullying. And we're showing the results for two different time periods. The first is the rate of homophobic bullying during the case compared to rates in the years prior to the case filing, which will be shown in red. And in the second, which is our main focus, is the rate of homophobic bullying after the case compared to the years prior to the case filing, which will be shown in green. And all of our analyses controlled for student, school, and county characteristics shown below. So in this first set of analyses, I'm showing you the results for schools that were involved in cases where the ruling was in favor of the student LGBTQ plaintiff. So in these schools, we see a 23% reduction in the rate of homophobic bullying after the case was resolved, which is a statistically significant reduction. Next, I'm showing you the results for schools that were involved in cases where the ruling was in favor of the defendant, in this case, the school or district. Here we see the reverse. We see a 27% increase in homophobic bullying after the case resolution. Although this is a non-significant increase, statistically, it provides some evidence of a potential for backlash effects. We then conducted 3 additional sets of analyses to further triangulate the evidence. First, there were no reductions in bullying related to race, ethnicity, religion, or gender after the litigation, suggesting that these effects were specific to homophobic bullying. Second, there was no association between litigation and an outcome we didn't expect litigation to influence, in this case, fruit juice consumption. So this falsification test helps us to be more confident about our interpretations. And third, we find evidence for spillover effects. So that is shown here. We see a 24% reduction in rates of homophobic bullying after the case resolution in spillover schools that were within the same school district as the school where the litigation was brought. But in contrast, we see a 7% increase in homophobic bullying in spillover schools where the litigation was found in favor of the defendant. So to summarize, we've provided quasi-experimental evidence that litigation seeking to improve school climates for LGBTQ youth may reduce rates of homophobic bullying. That we observe for litigation are comparable to resource-intensive, universal school-based bullying intervention programs, suggesting that litigation can meaningfully impact behaviors associated with stigma-based inequalities among youth. In addition, we estimated the number of children whose experiences of homophobic bullying would have been impacted if the effects of these lawsuits were scalable and transportable to the general population in California. And we find that the 23% reduction in homophobic bullying that we found would translate to an estimated reduction of 107,000 fewer children experiencing homophobic bullying in California. We also find evidence that these positive effects spill over into schools within the same district, and that the effect sizes for these spillover schools are comparable to those observed in the intervention schools, which likely occurred because any required changes resulting from litigation typically have to be implemented at the district level. At the same time, in the case where the school or district won, rates of homophobic bullying increased during the years after after the case was resolved, with the effect size suggesting the potential for backlash. So these findings of reactance to litigation are consistent with some legal theories and empirical evidence showing that increases in anti-gay prejudice were observed after the Supreme Court legalized same-sex marriage, but only in states where legislatures or the citizenry had not previously legalized same-sex marriage. And so our results suggest an interpretation of litigation that is somewhere between the worst fears of the pessimists and the best hopes of the optimists. While litigation can lead to reductions in bias-based bullying, this outcome depends both on how the case is decided and also likely on the institutional environment within which this decision takes effect. So where do we hope to take this work? Well, first, we think this research begins to provide a template for future work focused on determining the effect of litigation across a wide range of issues related to social inequalities among youth, such as fiscal equity, Title IX, and school discipline. Now, there's a real lack of research on the impact of litigation in each of these areas, suggesting the relevance of our approach to other fields of inequality. In addition to these research implications, we also think this work has potentially important practical implications as well. And so we're in the beginning stages of conducting qualitative interviews with legal scholars about these findings in order to determine their potential implications for legal practice. So I'll end there, but just want to end by acknowledging funding from the William G. Grant Foundation for this work, and also, most importantly, my many collaborators on this project, without whom this work certainly wouldn't be possible, including most especially my mentor, Stephen Russell, who made possible the data linkages that enabled us to examine these research questions in this project. So thanks again for the invitation to be here, and look forward to your questions during the Q&A session.
Thank you, Professor Hatzenbeuhler. And again, as we turn to our second speaker, I want to remind everyone that the questions box is open. You just have to click on it. And I can see that some questions are already coming in. Please continue to put your questions in the question box, and we will get to them after the second speaker. But for now, I'll turn to our second distinguished researcher, Professor Rachel Farr from the University of Kentucky. Rachel, over to you.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you all so much for having me. Over the next 10 minutes, I'll describe why research in this area is important. I'll talk a bit about my own research, particularly focused on my William T. Grant Scholars Program work, and end on a couple of notes of where we go from here. So families are vital context to consider in understanding children's development. Thus, it's critical that in studying LGBTQ+ people, we also consider their families. My own research is generally focused on LGBTQ+ individuals who want to be or who are parents. But I also want to build from Mark's talk in acknowledging that there's an important body of research that exists about the parents and families of LGBTQ+ youth. Here, I'll be emphasizing the youth who are raised by LGBTQ+ parents who sometimes may be LGBTQ+ themselves. Now, why is research about LGBTQ+ parents and their children important? One reason is that it has helped to address long-standing controversies surrounding who should be a parent or who can effectively be a parent, particularly in custody cases and in realms of adoption and foster care. I'll say that it was an amazing experience to have some of my own work, along with that of my colleagues, cited in amicus briefs in Obergefell v. Hodges, the marriage equality case in 2015, through the US Supreme Court, especially since the court ruled in a way that aligned with the larger body of work about the positive adjustment of children with same-gender parents. And there continue to be challenges to LGBTQ+ parenting rights at the level of the US Supreme Court, currently with Fulton versus the City of Philadelphia. Now, also, by including more diverse representation in studying LGBTQ+ people and the children they raise, we can also advance both theory and empiricism, particularly theories that to date have only been developed or applied to more narrow samples of cisgender heterosexual individuals, and empirical work that provides a more comprehensive understanding of what promotes healthy individual adjustment and overall family functioning. Studies about LGBTQ+ parent families offer lessons about resilience and belongingness that can benefit all individuals and families. Moreover, we know demographically that LGBTQ+ parent families are more diverse in terms of income, race, and geographic location in the United States than have been previously represented in the literature. That is, LGBTQ+ parents and their children are more likely to be lower income, BIPOC, and live in the South and the Midwest than studies have indicated. So getting right into it, and with the goal of emphasizing underrepresented experiences in the LGBTQ+ parent family research, I have been investigating the lived experiences of diverse youth with LGBTQ+ parents using intersectional, strengths-based, and mixed method approaches. And these are youth who are racially, socioeconomically, and geographically diverse, among other axes of diversity. And this work is a part of William T. Grant's Reducing Inequality portfolio that Adam did describe. I'm particularly focused on the specific practices that may reduce the harmful effects of discrimination. And although my Scholars Program work does involve a series of projects, today I'll highlight some of our qualitative findings from our stories and experiences of LGBTQ+ families from youth, or our Selfie project. Now, this is a study of 50 youth who we interviewed, all of whom are between 12 and 25 years old, and all who have at least one LGBTQ+ parent. And one contribution of our study, I think, is the very diverse and interesting sample that these youth represent in terms of variations in identities and demographic characteristics, including race, sexual orientation, gender identity, perceived social class, geographic region, family structure, such as the actual identity of their parent being lesbian, gay, bisexual, pansexual, transgender, queer, and so forth. And also how they joined their families, whether through adoption, foster care, surrogacy, other assisted reproductive technologies, or previous relationships, often previous heterosexual relationships. And I think you'll see some of this in the quotes that I'll show you in just a moment. And also, I do want to note that many, predominantly youth, came from the South and the Midwest, although they could come from anywhere across the United States. So within my lab, my students and I have been working on a variety of thematic analysis projects and sort of collapsing across a variety of themes. I'm going to highlight a few pictured here on the slide that I think are going to best illustrate some of our discovery of those specific practices, parenting, friendships, and community supports that may relate to positive developmental outcomes and reducing inequality for these youth. So in describing being raised by LGBTQ+ parents, participants often describe feeling normal and also unique, sometimes in the same breath. For example, Megan said, in this day and age, having a gay parent is a normal identity. Peyton said, until I was about 5 or 6, I was just sort of under the impression that having 2 moms was the same thing as having a mom and a dad. And Sarah noted, it's kind of like being raised with normal parents, straight parents. But also not really. But also I haven't really noticed because I've grown up with my gay stepmom for as long as I can remember, basically. And it's never been abnormal to me. Now, feeling unique sometimes related to experiences of stigma and discrimination. For instance, Molly said, I'm a little more unique because I've defended my family my whole life because I've seen my mom discriminated against. I've seen the pain it's brought my mom. And Claudia noted, my parents were definitely more strict than others. And I've always wondered if that stemmed from, community perception of how they're raising their kids. More pressure to have great kids who are smart. Because a lot of people, especially when I was younger, having 2 moms, would say, oh, in spite of her having 2 moms, she turned out great. Now, some stigma and discrimination was specific to experiences of coming out and disclosure about one's family. Lily noted, there were people that I really loved and that I was very close to who just got absolutely nasty when I told them about my dad. Audrey said that when her transgender father came out, there was a really, really bad reaction at school. So she was pretty much unemployed since then. And you see some intersection with class and income in this middle quote. Morgan, in an intersection with her own coming out, seems to lament the lack of a shared bond with her mom when she says, I think that with me coming out, it hasn't felt so, I don't know. She's been so secret and even negative about it in a weird way, even though we're both queer. So I don't think there's a sort of enthusiasm. Related to disclosure, telling others about having LGBTQ+ parents seems to be a dynamic process varying from fear of disclosure to openness, depending on age and a variety of other individual factors for these youth. Riley said, when I first told my best friend, I kind of felt shut out because I didn't know anyone else who had an LGBTQ+ family member, like a parent. And he was like, you're not the only one. He wasn't outing people and their family, but he was like, trust me, you're not the only people. Y'all aren't. Y'all not closed out. Everyone will accept you. Sarah noted, a lot of people my age think it's kind of cool. They're happy for LGBTQ plus families. Chloe said, I don't tell anyone. I just let them come over and I'm like, my mom is married to a transgender lesbian, okay? In my head, I'm just like, why should I have to warn someone about who my family is? And then a favorite quote among our participants, John noted, I'm not flashy, but I like to be flashy about my family. And kind of related to this note of positivity, when asked about positive aspects of having LGBTQ plus parents, many discussed feeling more open, as well as having and enjoying a greater sense of community belongingness as a result of having LGBTQ plus parents. So describing these elements, Tori said, I've gained a sense of openness and acceptance that allowed me to really be my authentic self in all ways. Peyton said, I had the upper hand. Or there was an upper hand that I had in my childhood of understanding other family dynamics and kinds of families before most of my peers even knew anything about the LGBTQ plus community. And Todd noted, they have instilled in me to treat everybody how they deserve to be treated. They taught me to be more open because of their identities. And of course, referring to his gay dads here. And Audrey said that a positive benefit of having LGBTQ plus parents is that you are part of a vibrant, amazing, loving community that's just so special. So pulling this all together, just a few take-home messages for you all. I think one really important takeaway is that LGBTQ plus parent families' experiences clearly are not homogenous or universal, including the youth who have LGBTQ plus parents. These are families who are diverse in their identities, how they form their families, how they parent their children and socialize them. And youth all have different experiences of all those different aspects as well. So in moving forward, it's important that we continue to diversify our research methods and representation in our samples, particularly in representing diverse backgrounds, including geographic region within the United States and elsewhere, socioeconomic status, race and ethnic identity, as well as family formation and other aspects of demographic characteristics. And I'll note in particular that youth who have experienced foster care and who are cared for by LGBTQ plus parents may be a particularly important group on which to focus, given the intersections with relevant child welfare policies and laws, like the ongoing Fulton versus City of Philadelphia Supreme Court case. This case does have ramifications for both LGBTQ plus parents and LGBTQ plus children in the child welfare system. And this group is pivotal to consider given the likelihood of foster youth to also be part of other marginalized groups in terms of race, ethnicity, and class. These are all focal areas of interest for the William T. Grant Foundation, as well as likely to be funding priorities of other organizations and entities. So to conclude, I just want to very much thank our selfie participants who have been highlighted in my talk today. And I want to thank all my lab members, particularly those who have worked intimately with the selfie data. And thank you to all of you for your attention. And I too look forward to the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. And indeed, the questions are starting to come in. I do want to remind our listeners to click on the question box on the side in the GoToWebinar box, and you can add your questions. I think we'll take a couple of questions for Rachel first and then go over to Mark. One question is, Rachel, are you finding regional differences in these issues about acceptance of youth parents? How about racial and ethnic differences?
Yes, so I mean, these analyses are ongoing. So this, what I'll say is a little anecdotal and preliminary, but my sense thus far is there are variations in our findings, I think by region, but it's sort of like you have to drill down even further. It could be more related to urbanicity rather than sort of the South or the Midwest per se. It seems to be very tied to almost local community levels and how youth perceive their family has sort of been embraced maybe within their own neighborhoods and schools among their peers and so forth. And we certainly are finding also variations in terms of racial and ethnic identity. it appears that many youth do highlight their own racial and ethnic minority identity as more salient or first than their LGBTQ plus parent family identity, which does make sense both in terms of it being a personal identity versus kind of a parent or a family identity, but also the youth seem to convey that that is also the case for their parents. So some of these youth emphasize the racial cultural socialization that their parents may be engaging in as a front runner as compared to, say, queer parent family socialization, if that makes sense. So those are a couple of things that I think are coming out of our findings, and we're excited to see more, especially as we move into additional projects within my scholars program work, where we'll have more mixed method and larger samples of data. Thanks so much.
Rachel. Yeah, there's a couple of questions about your research design. First, one listener would like to know what quantitative data, you mentioned that you're doing mixed methods research, so what quantitative data does your research include? And second, could you say more about how you recruited your children and families?
Yes, absolutely. So in my broader programs of work, I have been longitudinally following a somewhat large sample of adoptive families, including lesbian and gay parents, since I was in graduate school. So they were preschool age when I started the study. Now they're in adolescence. And so that study in many ways involves primarily quantitative data. And that's some of the data that has been sort of taken up in various court cases. It is the case that quantitative data often does seem to be quite important in terms of legal and policy settings, but I think the qualitative work has its place as well in terms of the richness of the stories that can be moving and can work in conjunction with the qualitative data. And as I move forward with my scholars program work, we will be collecting survey data in similar ways with youth, primarily adolescents, so 12 to 18-year-olds who also have at least one LGBTQ plus parent, and targeting the South and the Midwest, but having more of an emphasis on I mentioned survey, but also a daily diary component to explore sort of daily experiences of discrimination and microaggressions and how that might be related to various aspects of well-being, also coping behaviors, and so forth. In terms of how we've recruited the participants in the Selfie project, we did work locally. We're here in Kentucky, so we are situated in the South and are very close to the Midwest as well. So we partnered with various community organizations, and I myself am white and trying to recruit a more racially and ethnically diverse sample. I have collaborated quite closely, tried to forge connections with community members who are Black and multiracial and represent other racial ethnic minority identities in terms of recruitment and rapport building and sort of having stakeholders. And I think that's been really important. And not to mention, we have that represented purposefully, and we strive for that in the lab as well in terms of the coding teams and the students who might have been working to recruit our sample and conduct the interviews. So I think those are some of the things that have helped us in terms of recruitment. We also put in, as I'm thinking back on it, it feels like it's going back so long because this was pre-pandemic. We actually finished our data collection in February 2020, but we did things like have ads at Pride events and in different sorts of flyers and so forth in the community. And I'm happy to dig more into any of that if that would be helpful.
Thanks, Rachel. I'm going to shift grounds and turn to a few questions for Mark. First, Mark, do you have any evidence that the teachers in the schools that were experiencing litigation knew about the outcomes of the court cases?
That's a good question. We do not have that data, unfortunately, in this data set. So we're not able to look at teacher knowledge of the cases.
And Mark, what would you say about the policy implications of your results?
Well, I think that's in part the kind of what we're thinking about in this second part of the project, to talk more with legal scholars and practitioners about some of the more practice-oriented implications of this work. So we've just now started those interviews. So it's probably a little early to speak definitively about that, but one of the things that has been interesting in the small number of conversations we've begun having is how many lawyers have commented on how important the suggestive findings of backlash are in terms of the implications of that they really feel like it forces them to think more carefully about where and when they take on these cases, and to think about sort of institutional climate, the local climate, and other characteristics of the schools that might help them understand when to take these cases on, and when taking them on might potentially lead to more harm than good. So we need more research to understand how exactly that might happen. But those are some of the practice implications that we're interested in looking at more broadly.
Well, let me push you one step further. You mentioned in describing your conclusions that the size of the effect of litigation in cases that were settled in on the side of the plaintiff were comparable to the size of effects of universal school-based intensive programs. What would happen if you had both successful litigation and intensive interventions? Would you get double the effect? And what would happen if you lost the litigation, but you still had the program, the intensive program? Would that mitigate the potential harmful effects of unsuccessful litigation?
Yeah, those are great questions. And they're empirical questions, and we don't have the data to be able to answer those, but I think are important directions for future research. One of the things that we could look into that would be interesting is that we have data we've controlled for the presence of gay-straight alliances in the schools to see whether we see effects of litigation over and above existing practices that are occurring in schools to try and create positive LGBT climates. But one of the things we could do would be to look at interactions between the litigation and gay-straight alliances to see the extent to which the presence of already existing programs and practices and policies to create positive school climates might potentiate the effects of the litigation, or conversely, maybe might buffer the negative outcomes associated with an unfavorable ruling for an LGBT student if the school actually has these practices in place. So I think that this is sort of the first step in documenting some of these main effect associations between litigation and outcomes, but future directions include both some of these questions of moderation that you're suggesting, but also questions of mechanism. What is it about these cases? What are the kinds of institutional and teacher level and student level behaviors that litigation changes? And I think that's one of the directions we're particularly interested in taking this work in the future.
Thanks, Mark and Rachel, for your thoughtful responses to questions. Some more questions are continuing to come in, but we need to turn to the next part of our webinar, which is going to be on opportunities for funding. And for that, I'll turn to Dr. Jenny Irons from the William T. Grant Foundation. Jenny, over to you.
Thanks so much, Adam. So we'll turn our attention now to how to apply for grants at the William T. Grant Foundation. And today I will focus on applying for grants through our Scholars Program and Major Grants Program. In keeping with the focus of this webinar, I will also highlight our Reducing Inequality focus area. In our Reducing Inequality focus area, we welcome a range of studies. We welcome descriptive studies that clarify processes for reducing inequality, intervention studies that examine attempts to reduce inequality, and measurement studies of inequality that will enhance the work of researchers, practitioners, or policymakers to address inequality. It's important to note that we also welcome a range of methodological approaches to examine these questions. What's important for us is that the proposed methodological approach aligns very well with the questions that a study asks. It's also important for us to see that an application is clear about how the findings of a study will test, build, or inform a program, policy, or practice that addresses inequality, whatever the methodological approach. In making the case that your work is a fit with Foundation interest in our studies on reducing inequality, we ask that you clarify and conceptualize the dimension or dimensions of inequality on which your study focuses. Today, we're talking about research that seeks to reduce inequality for LGBTQ youth, but I'll note that we encourage such studies to also explore how sexual or gender identity intersects with other dimensions the Foundation prioritizes, like race, ethnicity, economic standing, and immigrant status. We also want to see how the response examined will improve or is expected to improve outcomes for young people. And finally, it's important to note that we support studies that examine responses to inequality in multiple systems and settings, such as child welfare, education, the justice system, the labor market, and families. The important thing for us is that we can see how a study will examine a program, policy, or practice that is expected, for example, to improve outcomes for LGBTQ youth. I'll talk a little bit now about our William T. Grant Scholars Program, which is a program that both of the grantees you heard from today are part of. The goal of this program is to fund studies that build theory and empirical evidence on reducing inequality, as well as to facilitate the professional development of early career scholars in the social, behavioral, and health sciences. We seek applicants who have demonstrated success in conducting high-quality research and are looking to extend their work to new areas. And this is what we mean that the awards support stretch in your expertise. Folks who apply for this award are people who are interested in stretching their methodological, substantive, content expertise in ways that they wouldn't be able to do otherwise without the support of this award. The award provides $350,000 for 5 years in support of research and mentoring, and that mentoring is an important element of this program. Scholars work with 2 mentors who can help support their stretch areas. You're eligible for this award if you are building a promising career in the social, health, or behavioral sciences and are within 7 years of receiving your PhD. You must be in a career ladder position and nominated by your institution. And note that only 1 nomination is allowed per college or division within an institution. Applications are accepted annually in July and reviewed by our Scholar Selection Committee. And scholars are also offered opportunities to network and build their skills through meetings and workshops with one another and with other foundation grantees. I'll just put a little note here that it's important to give yourself time to prepare this application. It's quite an extensive application, and you'll want to work closely with your identified mentors in developing a mentoring plan to advance and stretch your expertise. I'll say a little bit now about our major research grants program. The goal of this program is to fund studies that build theory and empirical evidence on reducing inequality. Major grants on reducing inequality typically range from $100,000 to $600,000 and cover 2 to 3 years of support. There are 3 deadlines across the year for this program in January, May, and August. Applicants who submit a letter of inquiry, which is a 5-page initial application, and have promising projects will be invited to submit a full proposal for further consideration. At this stage, we invite roughly 15 to 17% of applicants to submit a full proposal. These proposals undergo external and internal review, and our senior staff make recommendations about which studies to recommend to our board for funding. I'll also note that within our major research grants program, we also support smaller grants, our officers' research grants, and they typically range from $25,000 to $50,000. Please do note that applications for officers' research grants are accepted only in January and August. I want to share a few tips with you if you're thinking about applying to the foundation. First of all, it's important to review our materials carefully to make sure your proposed research is a strong fit with the program goals and foundation priorities. As I mentioned earlier, one thing that's very important for us to look for in our review process is that the research design methods and analyses are tightly aligned. It's also important in any application and at any stage that you provide sufficient information for reviewers to evaluate the rigor and appropriateness of methods. It's important to acknowledge that you understand the strengths as well as limitations of your proposed study. And finally, if you receive feedback and advance further in the process, it's always important to respond to reviews seriously, graciously, and in depth. One thing I'll just mention for today is if you're proposing a study to the foundation to reduce inequality among LGBTQ youth, it would be important in an application, for example, to briefly document the nature of the inequality, but it's important for us to see that the study substantively focuses on the way forward to improve outcomes for LGBTQ youth, and for example, identifies what we might think of as a malleable lever for change that could be adjusted so that LGBTQ youth outcomes are improved. I'd also like to point you to our website where we have many resources for potential applicants to review to think about whether or not their research is a fit and then how to go through our research application process. We have research grants application guides that we review every year to make sure they're up to date and to see that they provide clear submission instructions. We also provide annotated proposals that you can review to see what we think of as strong proposals in both of these programs. There are frequently asked questions, relevant papers and essays. In short, just a lot of resources for you to look at to try to understand our process as best you can. Finally, I want to note that we emphasize across all of our programs that we strive to support a diverse group of researchers in terms of race, ethnicity, gender, and seniority. And we encourage research projects led by African American, Latinx, Native American, and Asian Pacific American researchers. We also welcome multidisciplinary and mixed method studies. And finally, resubmissions are also welcome. Please use the feedback that you may receive in a prior year or perhaps from another foundation to submit an even stronger application to us. Thanks again so much for joining us today, and we'll pause now to take questions.
Thanks, Jenny. A few questions have come in. I'm going to take the first one, which came from two different people, about whether applicants who are not at universities are eligible for the William T. Grant Scholars Program. And so the answer is yes. You do not need to be in at a university or an academic setting to apply for the Scholars Program. You do need to be in a career ladder position. So if you're a scientist, an assistant scientist at an organization that conducts research or a nonprofit, you're eligible. If you're a postdoctoral fellow, you're not eligible until you achieve that career ladder position in your next role. For the major research grants, there's no limitation on the role that you may hold inside or outside academia. You do have to be at a nonprofit organization. Okay, turning to further questions. There's a request for a link to learning about the Officers Research Grant, so we'll try to post that up in the chat. Jenny, here's a question for you about the William T. Grant Scholars Program. Do you need to have a clearly specified idea of your future studies to apply for the Scholars Program?
Well, you need to have a clearly specified idea for your project. So some applicants apply to do one big project, one overall project. Other applicants apply with 3 separate but related projects. So you do want to apply with a very clear sense of what you're going to be working on, and it's also helpful to see the ways in which the studies that you propose may fit with your overall research agenda you have with your career. And again, another part of the application is the development of a mentoring plan where you demonstrate the ways in which the studies that you propose will stretch your content, methodological, or other areas of expertise that you develop in partnership with your proposed mentors.
And Jen, here's another question for you. If one is invited to submit a full proposal for the research grant, what's the timeline for submission of the full proposal? How long after the invitation to submit?
That's a great question. If you're invited to submit a full proposal, you will be given 2 different dates. So one date is roughly about 6 weeks out from initially being invited to submit a full proposal, and the later date is usually more like 3 to 4 months out from the initial invitation. So you get to choose whether or not you want to get that full proposal in quickly or take a little more time to do so.
And Jenny, for the major research grants, what kind of restrictions are there on what funds can be used for? What's the policy on indirect costs, for example?
Oh, thanks, Adam. So our policy on indirect costs is that can constitute no more than 15% of the grant. And we expect that the funding is used primarily for research activities. So what that means is we're not going to fund an application, for example, where the funds are primarily going to the intervention itself, to the program itself. Rather, what we support is the research to study the intervention.
Thanks, Jenny. And while we allow more questions to come in on the grant-making process, I'm going to go back to the questions for Mark and Rachel. and pose one more interesting question that I didn't have a chance to ask earlier. And this is a question about categorization of youth in different gender diverse categories. This questioner is concerned. Often we use a global category like LGBTQ or LGBTQ plus or LGBTQIA plus, but gender diverse youth who have more dire health risks may get lost in the struggle. How are you thinking about this issue of capturing the different categories into which gender diverse youth may fall?
Rachel, do you want to start or do you want me to?
Why don't you start, Mark, if that's okay?
Sure. Well, I guess thanks for that question. The first thing I would say is that we need to start measuring it in studies. And the California Healthy Kids Survey, which is the data set that I'm using for the outcome, is one of the small number of large-scale data sets that just very recently started to even include measures of gender identity. And so, there's the sort of well-known adage of you don't count if you're not counted. And I think that there's increasingly we're slowly starting to see these large-scale data sets begin to include measures of gender identity to really make sure that we're getting exactly to the questioner's point, a better understanding of the unique risk, but also protective factors related to diverse gender identities among youth. So it's a really important point that the field is finally coming to in terms of beginning to measure these identities in a way that will help us address some of these questions.
Thanks, Mark. And I would second Mark's comments, and thank you for that really important question. My own research, because it is more focused on LGBTQ plus parents, I can tell you from the research on that or in that area that these topics often are handled, and I think appropriately so, as sort of distinct sets of topics and experiences. So it's as if there is a whole body of work on sexual minority parents and then also trans and gender diverse parents who have very different experiences than other cisgender sexual minority parents and their children and families. So I think it's just really important that when research might more collectively attend to LGBTQ plus individuals' experiences, that the researchers, the authors are very clear about who is in the sample or to whom they are referring, whose voices are actually represented. I think there's a lot of discussion both in our broader community and scholarly community that don't just tack on the T if transgender and gender diverse individuals are not represented. So that is something like, in my own work, I can speak to that I do strive towards that. And I do see ways in which our literature has, again, appropriately, I think, attended to the experiences being distinct. And I agree with the person who put the question and comment in the chat that the difficulties, the challenges, and the consequences are often far more dire for our trans and gender diverse youth as well as adults. So I just appreciate the comment and question very much. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm going to stay with Rachel and shift grounds a little bit. Could you say what your opinion is about using social media data as a means to study inequality or harassment in schooling?
Oh gosh, that's a really interesting question. I think I'll have to admit that being a parent to young children, I feel so out of touch with social media overall. So I'm a little less well-versed in this. Maybe Mark will have some good thoughts on this too. I think given that youth clearly are engaging with social media almost constantly, and I think there's data to support that, it seems like we would be remiss as researchers not to attend to it and consider it carefully in terms of a method of assessing experiences for these youth. But maybe it also needs to be a comprehensive and holistic assessment with other aspects of youth's lives, making sure that youth are youth experiences are sort of assessed in terms of their own reports, maybe more directly, whether it's through interview or survey data, getting additional informants, whether that's parents or teachers or peers. So I think those are just some brief thoughts, but I'd be interested in what others think too.
Mark?
Well, I guess I'll just quickly say, just give a shout out to another William T. Grant scholar whose work is exactly at this intersection of LGBTQ youth and social media, and in particular looking at internet-based platforms, Brian Mustansky. So I would definitely recommend checking out some of his work on this topic.
Thank you. We are just about at the end of time. I guess we have time, Jenny, for one last question for you. What about updated guidelines for the Scholars Program for 2021?
Adam, I believe those were recently released. Am I correct that the application?
So yep, there it is. Download the 2021 guidelines, and so I'm going to post them in response to the listener, and then we will be all set. Here you go, listener. Send to all. Everybody should be able to see them. All right, folks, we've come to the end of our allotted hour. I want to thank again Professor Mark Hatzenbeuhler from Harvard University, Professor Rachel Farr from the University of Kentucky, Jenny Irons, Dr. Jenny Irons from the William T. Grant Foundation, and our communications staff, Billy Hunter and Lenore Nair, for running this webinar. And thank you to everyone who listened in and stayed with us. We invite researchers to propose grants. We invite our partners in the funding community to contact us, and we're going to be in touch as well about partnering in this important area of work, and we look forward to advancing this important issue. Thanks again.